All right, so here we go. So again, my name is Janine Smith. You're here for the ASOS Grantee Family Engagement Training. We are Mass Mentoring Partnership, an organization that works across the state to support youth-adult relationships. Just some housekeeping. Again, thank you so much for kind of sticking with me this morning with our technical difficulties. I have the settings so that everyone is muted. I'm hoping that you can hear me. It appears that my sound is working, but I want to make sure. If folks can't hear me, can they please, in either the chat or the question function, let me know. It looks like, okay, so someone, Mobile, thank you so much for confirming that you can hear me. We are recording this session, so we will have this all available for you afterwards. I will certainly send out the webinar presentation so that you can review it and use that at your leisure. So let's get started with a little bit about mass mentoring, and we'll hop into our content here. Again, if you have any questions, please just use the little kind of question or chat function. I will be checking that periodically so that I can respond to your questions as needed. So, first thing, Mass Mentoring Partnership. Just want to share a little bit about who we are. I know some folks are familiar with us, but we, again, work across the state to ensure that young people and adults are in healthy, empowering relationships. We believe that relationships are a lever for positive youth outcomes and that all young people deserve relationships. And we do this, we have a framework called Relationships in Action, and that's the way we work. So first we assess. We go out into communities, we learn what is happening, we try to understand who's in relationship, who's in programs, how can we best support those people, and then we're able to craft our services and our offerings to support the work that is happening out there. We actually have a biannual survey called Mass Mentoring Counts, where it used to be more of a census and now it's turning more into a qualitative study to understand what are the needs of our communities, knowing that each community has different needs. From there, that's where we identified our focused areas. So, the communities of Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Cape and Islands, Hampden County out in Western Mass, and in North Shore we have Lynn, Lawrence, and Salem. So that's what we do first. We try to see what's happening. We build capacity by offering trainings, webinars, offerings such as this. We also have an AmeriCorps program where we have members across the state building capacity in formal, structured youth programming. And that way, we can continue to build capacity of organizations and ensure that young people are being served in the best way possible. Then we advocate, right? We actually have a lobbyist on staff. We make sure that we help our programs understand the importance of advocacy. That picture right there is Lily Mendez, our CEO, at Youth Mentoring Day, which is our big advocacy day that we do in January, National Mentoring Month. We actually have a line item in the governor's budget where this year we received $1 million that we redistribute to formal structured mentoring programs. So we really believe in a policy response to advocate for young people and really support our programs to do that. And then we connect, right? We bring people together, whether it's through a training, a webinar, events such as MMP Connects, which my colleague Milani does out in Western Mass. And we really know that you all are doing the work, and we want to bring you together to share best practices and learn from you all. So that's our framework. People experience us in a lot of different ways. Maybe some of you have been to trainings from us before. Maybe some of you have seen some of our, work out there on our website. Maybe some of you have attended some of our match activities. That's another resource that we also have. So tickets to games, we do scholarships, we have grant opportunities. So we really try to support organizations, people, communities, young people, the best way that we can. So who are we? This is our program services team. There are, more of us at the organization, but in terms of who you probably interact with the most as program folks, this is us. Again, Janine Smith, Senior Manager of Program Services. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I am, my background is in youth development. My career started in AmeriCorps, informal structured mentoring programs. Spent some time in the sector with youth work and adult work. Went to grad school and got an MBA in nonprofit management, and realized that I really enjoyed working in the sector, but I also know that programs need support. So kind of moved away from that direct service role and more into capacity building, which I've been doing at MMP for the last 5 years. Beth Fraster, some of you may have met, VP and Chief Program Officer. She leads our team. Milani Mendoza, who is on the line as well. She's our Western Mass Manager of Community Engagement. Cameron Fear, some of you may have met and known from some of our trainings. He is our Manager of Training and Technical Assistance. And then Miguel Torres, our other Manager of Community Engagement. He works in the communities of Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Lynn and Lawrence. So we can send out our contact information after this training. So if you want to connect with any of us, please feel free. So we have about 29 people on the line, and so we're not going to do formal introductions. I have all your contact information from your registration, but what I want to do, I want to try to launch a poll. I'm going to see if this works, and I just want to know where people are from. Because it gives a sense of just geographically where you're representing. So I have a little poll here that says where you're from. The options are Boston Metro, Central, South, Cape, and Islands, which I know I could only have about 5 options. So I wanted to do South Coast and then Cape and Islands as a separate one, but it would not let me do that. We have North Shore and then Western Mass. So I'm going to launch the poll, and then you can just respond, letting us know quickly where you're from. And we'll share those results in a moment. Oh, excuse me. All right, we'll leave that open for a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll now, and we can share our results. So we have about half of the folks from Boston metro area. We've got some Central Mass folks. South Cape and Islands not here today, but I'm sure out and about doing good work. North Shore, and then Western Mass at 15%. So thank you so much for sharing. Again, I have the registration list, so I know the breadth of organizations that are represented here. And definitely appreciate the work that you do, and want to learn and share from you during the course of this webinar. So before even getting into the webinar, I want to just kind of acknowledge where we're at, right? The situation we're in, what is happening in our world. A lot of you, are working in schools, with young people who are in schools. Most programs that I know have paused their programming given everything that's happening with the coronavirus. And so for us in mass mentoring, we think that this is actually a time as we're thinking about relationships, parent engagement, continuing relationships. If you're in a mentoring program, we would call some of this match support. And so I'm curious, just I want to acknowledge that situation, right? And I'm curious kind of where people are at, what they're doing, what's going on in your heads. I didn't want to just go through this webinar and be like, oh, everything's fine and everything's good, right? No. This is kind of unprecedented times for us. And I think, as we go through the course, the content, um, I have not been able to necessarily adapt the content for thinking about what do we do in remote times, for those of us who are still communicating with parents and still kind of doing this work. But I'm just curious if folks want to share either in the chat little box or in the question box, what are you doing right now, right? So those of you who are either running programming, which I think most people are probably remote at this moment, but for those who've suspended programming, obviously schools are, not in session, most of the schools that I know. How are you staying connected, or what have your plans been to stay connected, particularly as we're talking about family and caregiver engagement? So I just want to kind of throw it out there to see what's going on in your heads, or what big questions do you have. I may not be able to answer any of those, but again, just to acknowledge where we are in our world right now. So I'll give folks a moment to share if you want to. I'll get the presentation back up on the screen, and then I'll read some of your responses. So just kind of what's going on in your heads as you think about family and caregiver engagement in our current situation. Great. All right. So I'm gonna read some of your questions here, or your responses. We have turned to offering after school webinars with our participants. Many of our, and that was Rebecca responded. Medi is saying many of our community programming we have moved totally to online, so our advocacy and career readiness in-person workshops have become webinars with great success so far. That's wonderful. I mean, I will say this webinar, we had about 70 registrants, and we usually have a fair amount of drop off. So, and we have 31 attendees right now. So we're almost a little under half, but Mass Mentoring Partnership is in the process of figuring out, how do we craft online engaging webinars, work through all the technical difficulties, and make something that we could still disseminate content to people. So definitely interested in what people are doing out in the community. We have been doing Zoom meetings to keep in touch with families. That's great. We are not having in-person visits with families. Rather, we are having phone calls and our video calls with family. And so that was Maria who said Zoom meetings, and Maggie doing the phone calls. Ensuring access to necessary technology to conduct online learning, and that's Alana. And I think that's a great point, as we even have gone remote, and we run that AmeriCorps program, and we're hosting, we have a meeting coming up on Friday, and are doing that all remotely, not taking for granted, right, that people may not have access to the technology that would allow them to participate in things like webinars or Zoom calls or anything. And so really checking in with people and thinking about how can we make this as accessible as possible. It's hard not being able to provide for families. It's such a hard time, Kelsey. And then at Science Club for Girls, we have suspended programming for the spring semester, sharing at-home resources and activities with our club participants. So, people out there doing, I think, the best that we all can to figure out how we best support young people and their families in this moment. So thank you for sharing that. I just, again, wanted to acknowledge what is, going on in our world, and see how people are adjusting and adapting. So for our training, and a lot of this was actually taken from some work that we've done around home visits and things like that. So we're not going to go into that content, but we will discuss a little bit about our developmental relationship framework because I think it's relevant. We're going to look at the distinction. This is where we'll spend most of our time between family involvement versus family engagement. And see some research around how this actually really works. Not going to do the life of a home visit, but also then think about core values and how the core values play out then in our work. And I don't think we're going to have time to practice, but just give you some content and some overview and some framings to maybe have us think either differently or refresh our thinking, remind us of some of the thinking that we've always had as it relates to families and caregivers. So first thing, always want to go over positive youth development. I think many of us, even if we may not call it this is how we approach our work. So it's an intentional pro-social approach, engages youth within their community, schools, organizations, peer groups, and families in a manner that is productive and constructive, recognizes, utilizes, and enhances youth strengths, right? So if you remember nothing else about positive youth development, it is about focusing on young people's strengths and assets. And promotes positive outcomes, and it really is based in relationships as well, and furnishing the support needed to build on their leadership strengths. So positive youth development, people have been doing this, since young people have been young people, but as kind of a research field and a kind of theory and way that we look at young people in youth work, kind of came about in the 90s, right? Karen Pittman, some other folks really started looking at, okay, we've been telling young people not to do a lot of things. And, as a 90s baby, I remember DARE and don't do drugs, don't get pregnant, don't do all these things. And so folks said, well, young people are doing great things and have lots of skills and strengths. Why don't we focus on supporting those leadership strengths, those skills that they have, the beauty that is within young people, and focus on that. And so positive youth development says, how can we help young people build those skills and competencies so that they can be successful in the future? And so as we're thinking about that and thinking about family engagement, I want to start with that because we believe that all families, all of us want the best for young people, right? And all of us should be able to see the beauty and the strength in young people. And part of it is how do we work with families and caregivers to see what they see in their children, right? And then to be able to say, all right, how can I support your dreams, your young person's dreams, so that they can be successful? How is my program set up in a way that promotes positive youth development, that I can support you, caregiver, parent, family member, in promoting positive youth development as well? Right, so just a framework that I think is helpful for us to be mindful of as we move through the rest of the training. And also as we're thinking about parents and caregivers, right, we want to think about strengths-based approach to working with them, right? We can see the good and the strength and the beauty that families bring to our work and see them as a partner to be engaged versus a challenge, right? So the Search Institute, and again, just want to go into this briefly, they are based in Minnesota, and they, for many of us, might be familiar with the 40 developmental assets. So these are 40 skills that young people need to be successful. They've done a lot of research and gave this list to youth workers and parents and teachers and people, anyone who's working with young people. And, we said, wait a second, we can't check off 40 things every time we're engaging with young people. So then they started digging deeper and said, well, where does this happen? Where do young people get those skills and strengths? And really realized that it's in relationship. And so it's not just any kind of relationship, it's a very specific type of developmental relationship. So it's a close connection that powerfully and positively shapes young people's identities and helps them develop thriving mindsets. So as we're thinking about the ways that we want to be engaged with young people, we always want to be thinking about how are we supporting young people to develop that thriving mindset, that growth mindset, that mindset that says, what's next, what's new, how do I learn from failure, how do I move on to the next thing, remembering the lessons that I've learned, how do I know that I can do it, my intelligence is not fixed, and that I can learn and grow and continue to be successful. With that said, young people get this from a lot of different places. And so I wanted to share this, and I do this in a lot of our trainings that we have with teachers and other folks. But this chart here, essentially, they being Search Institute, in their research surveyed over, I think, 25,000 young people in a major American city. And they asked young people, where do you get these these particular kind of assets of the developmental relationship framework, right? And so there's 5 things, right? Express care, challenge growth, provide support, share power, and expand possibilities that adults can do for young people. 5 actions, if you will. And looking at middle and high school students and asking them, where do you get this from, right? So these are the percentages of young people in that community who said they experience each of the 5 elements of the developmental relationships often or very often within each type of relationship. I want to just note that all the way over here to the left, we have parenting adults. And so you see that those numbers, I believe, are the highest for any of the other categories. So we have parenting adults, siblings, friends, teachers, and program leaders. Many of us would sit in the program leaders, maybe there's some teachers on the line. But just to note that, as we think about parent engagement, caregiver engagement, young people are saying, this is where I get my needs met. They also get their needs met with us, but the overwhelming majority of young people are saying that 86% of them said often or very often express care as parenting adults, 87% for challenge growth, 67%, right? Yes, often or very often provide support. My parents do this for me, or my parenting adult. 68% share power, which is really hard to do. I think adults sometimes we struggle a lot in that. And then 52% for expand possibilities. And then I want to note what they said about program leaders, right? Because I think we always we want to assume the best, and we know that we're doing really good work. And I use this slide not to necessarily shame us, but to say we believe and know that we're doing good work, and yet we want to be able to have the young person understand and know that we are expressing care, challenge growth, provide support, share power, expanding possibilities. And so, how that young person absorbs that and feels that and is able to communicate that, yes, often or very often, I get these 5 elements is important. Right, what we do is really important, but the impact, our intent might be to do these things, but the impact. The young people in this community said express care 54%. Right. And I think, whenever I do the developmental relationships, we always, think it's a given that express care is kind of what we do best. But 54% of young people said often or very often, 67% challenge growth, 50% provide support, share power 52%, and expand possibilities only 40%. Teachers, those numbers fluctuate a little bit, but are a little lower. Friends, you see, young people are getting this from their friends and their siblings as well. So I show this again to say that, number one, different relationships can contribute different strengths, right? So there are different ways that young people interact with the different people in their life, and they need all of us, right? They need, I always say, the more the merrier. The more positive, empowering, developmental relationships, the better for young people. But just to highlight that, let's not discount how important the relationship with parenting adults or caregivers is. And how do we help young people build on that? Because we see that they're building skills, they're getting things from those relationships. So, I always like to say, so 52% is expanding possibilities. If I'm a program leader, I'm going to blow that out of the water, right? Because I'm like, all right, you're getting that in small doses, or you're telling me that in other places, you can't say often or very often more than 50% of the time, right? So how can I support you in that way? And I think as we are in relationship with young people and their families are able to ask those questions of, what do you need from me? How can I best support you? Mom, dad, auntie, caretaker. What are the ways that this program can support your young person? And so having this framework, I think, is a really cool and interesting place to start. And again, if there are any questions throughout, let me know. And these are just some quick slides to show the number of relationships, right? They show the relationship between the more relationships that a young person has, the less likely it is that they will have um, sort of less than positive outcomes, or in this case, showing that the more relationships, the more likely it is that they will have a particular positive outcome. So academic motivation, right, increases as the number of strong relationships. So again, not just any relationship, a strong developmental relationship, social emotional skills increase with the number of relationships. Responsibility, so taking responsibility for their own actions, that increases with the number of strong relationships. And then this one, you show the relationship between high risk behaviors decreases as young people, the more relationships they have. So how do we, right, work with parents to be another strong relationship, work with caregivers to make sure that young people are getting what they need so that we can see these positive skills and traits going up, and the high risk behaviors and the challenging kind of pieces decrease. And so I'm not going to go through this. We will share this with you, but these are the 5 things. So express care, provide support, challenge growth, share power, and expand possibilities. And you'll see under each of them, there are then additional actions that you can do. This is something that any setting, anywhere, any young person can experience. I would also argue it's not necessarily intended to be used with adults and adult to adult interaction, but when you look at these things, expressing care, we need that in relationship with adults. How do you express care? How are you dependable? How do you believe in families? How are you warm? How are you encourage families? How do you help families navigate? How do you empower caregivers and families? How do you advocate? I think that's one of the biggest things we can do: advocate for young people and support also families and caregivers in advocacy. Challenge growth. How do we expect the best of families, right? And we'll talk about that. What do we believe about families? Sharing power. How do we respect caregivers and families? How do we collaborate with them? And how do we let them lead in certain ways? How do we get out of the way and really, again, see them as partners and leaders in this work that we do? And expanding possibilities, broad horizons, connecting families. I think a lot of us probably do that really well, and our resource brokers. But again, these things are actions that we do for young people, and we are, one kind of little nodule in like a web of support that young people have, and realizing that families are one place, other programs that they're in, siblings, young people, school, in school time. And so kind of what is our place as a out of school time, after school person, youth leader in this young person's life? So, want to move on between and look at just family involvement versus family engagement. So, for us, we really believe that there are 2 different ways that we can connect with young people, or excuse me, young people and their families. And so, what we want to see is how do we shift, right, from just being involved to supporting families and really being engaged. And so you see, we've broken it down in a few different ways, thinking about the initiation, invitation, the roles, and the purpose. And that there's a difference here in the way that this looks. So I'm going to go through each one, and as I go through, I want you to be thinking about, where do I sit, right? Like, I really love things like this where you can kind of map or kind of see, um, all right, maybe in some initiation I might sit in involvement, but when it comes to roles, I really think we're more in engagement. So I want people to think about the things that you do, the ways that you work with families, support families, and be honest with yourself. Where do we think we're at? And after this, I'm going to ask you, to kind of brainstorm and respond using our question or chat function. And just share a little bit, maybe some examples of the ways that you do these things. So I'll read them out really briefly. And again, I want folks to be thinking about really, what does this look like for us in our school or our setting? So with initiation, right, the ideas and the energy tend to come from the agency, from the program. Um, with family engagement, the ideas tend to be elicited from families by agency staff, right? So really key difference of where does the idea of kind of the way that you work with and support families come from. Obviously, you as a program want to do that work, but how you do the work, or the way that you maybe begin that work, really thinking about how are we working with families to get the ideas, right? Do you just uh, decide that you're going to do a family engagement night at 6 p.m., when people are just getting off of work and can't get to the actual activity? Or have you talked to families and say what works for you? Invitation, right? So the agency might be irritating to families, pushing them to do something. Um, what are the ways that you are inviting families into your organization, into your program? With family engagement, families are challenged to do something about what they feel is important to them. So again, what does that look like in terms of where the energy is coming from? Roles with involvement, families are generally directed towards completing tasks selected by the agency staff. Fill this out, do this, show up to this, uh, bring this to the potluck, things like that. Engagement, families are considered leaders or a potential leader who is integral to identifying a vision and goals. So they're much more involved and much more engaged in programming, right? In the way that not only they want to show up, but the way that you show up for their young person. And then thinking about purpose, agencies tend to focus on supporting students by strengthening and assisting agency programs, right? So with family involvement, it is very much about our program, right? The thing that we're doing, and how can you strengthen our stuff? Family engagement looks a little different. The agency support students by developing family relationships and often working with parents to improve local community, right? So it's much more, again, focused on, more organically, more holistically, what do we need to do? Acknowledging that, just like, thinking about a web of support, your program is not the one and only thing in this young person's life, in this family's life, right? So they sit in a broader community context. And so, what does that look like to have relationships and work and support parents in that broader community context? So that, not only are you embedding yourself in the community, which is definitely more likely to make sure that you are providing the right kind of support to young people, but also embedding yourself more in what the family needs and understanding the needs of the family and the young people. So thinking about your organization, thinking about these 4 areas of initiation, invitation, roles, purpose, where do you all sit? What are some examples, if you want to share, either of things that you're doing really well that you think would kind of be in one area, or if you want to pose, a question of, all right, we do this. How do I move this thing from family involvement to family engagement? So, for instance, if you believe that your organization does a really great job at engaging families as leaders, right, in terms of that role section. So maybe you have a family council that meets periodically. Maybe you do family conference calls and, kind of listen to what the family's needs and then develop programming based on that quarterly. That could be a great example that you'd want to share. For people who perhaps, you're in family involvement in some areas, maybe you realize that, an invitation, family seems to be really irritated with you, right? Maybe, I've heard a lot of times from programs that we don't quite always understand kind of the attitude that families may have, or their perception or the way that they engage with us. All right, so thinking about what might I be doing that's irritating to families? Where is that coming from? What are the ways that you invite families? If it's, well, we always send a paper letter to families telling them about certain things, but we never actually call or email or have more in-person communication, that might be part of the problem. So I want you to think about, just for a little bit, and I see some hands already, just share either any examples on either side, and we can either brainstorm together if there's an example of, like, I have a question about how I would shift or I want to share with you all something that I think, is really good that I'm doing. So if you want to toot your horn a little bit. So I'll take a minute or so for folks to respond to that if you'd like to, and then we'll move along. And I should say, obviously, we started a little bit late. I believe I have this on the calendar until 12:30. I'm going to try to wrap up and get us out of here sooner than that, but just want to acknowledge that we definitely will go a little longer than 12. So if anyone wants to share anything that you're doing that's really well. All right, I see Robin. We have different committees within our organization. Ask parents to be on the committees, for example, with our diversity initiative. We can do better at being more engaged with invitations for things like our surveys and match support. Thank you so much, Robin, for sharing that, right? So I should put a plug in here for mentoring programs. Mass Mentoring Partnership has something called Quality-Based Membership Initiative, and it kind of looks at your programming and uses the elements of effective practice to apply high-quality standards to your programs. And one of the things, we're always updating those and making sure that we're staying current with kind of the needs of programs and encouraging them. It's a continuous improvement process to kind of be better and do better. And parent and family engagement is one of the things that we're adding to those lists of standards. So how do you engage parents and families, whether it's in committees and advisory council? What does that look like for you to really get the support and really approval of families and buy-in, so that you can have better relationships between mentors and mentees. Research shows that, especially with mentoring, one-to-one mentoring specifically, the more engaged the family or caretakers are with the program, even with the mentor, the more likely that relationship is to be successful. And so we have a few more people. I'll share that. So Kelsey is saying, I work at a low income facility where there are a lot of families that are on vouchers, et cetera. So getting the families as involved as possible is a big focus we try to make happen. We do a family barbecue every June, and we also put on a Halloween party for the children and parents every October. Some other things we do are ice cream socials, parent conferences, et cetera. We definitely could do better with engaging families. Great, thank you for sharing that. Maggie, in our program, we have specific goals from DCF to work on with each family. We always ask if the family agrees with the goals, why or why not, and if they have any of their own goals to add. Then we work on all the goals, personal as well as DCF goals. And that's really great, Maggie, because a lot of times, we'll talk about this in a little bit. Some of these systems and programs, I think we represent institutions to families, and their relationship with those institutions can often be challenging. So, the fact that you are working with DCF and that's kind of embedded in part of your programming, but you're also saying, these are the things that the system is recommending and saying, and we want to hear from you, right? Do you agree with that? Do you not agree with that? We want your voice. We need your voice, and we want to develop goals that we can work on together. I think that's great. Maria is saying, excuse me one second. We have a Zoom meeting and invite the families to join. Today was the first one and was a success. That's great. Congratulations. The parents and youth could see their teachers and say hello. Next meeting, we will try to break them into groups. We also have many saying, we find that occasionally parents wanting their youth to participate, but because of the challenges with logistics, transportation getting in the way, not always sure how to support with those logistics based on what we can provide as an organization. At the end of the day, the youth suffers because they can't access our materials, and families are frustrated that this is not working for them. Thank you so much for sharing, one of your challenges. I think is hard, given that there are lots of different barriers to family engagement, that we encounter. And in fact, I have a poll that I want to ask people. What are those barriers that you encounter? So I'm going to pop that up right now. I listed just a few, and if there are other things, you can also kind of list those in the chat function. I have time, language, perception of school, and interest. So I'm going to launch the poll again. Those are just like 4 things that I thought of. If there are other things, please, feel free to share those with me. And when I say perception of school, that could be perception of programming. That's kind of what I was talking about in terms of how families relate to systems. So I'm going to launch the poll. And I want you to let me know what you think, and select which one is your biggest barrier, really. All right, I'm going to close this out. All right, so close poll. I'm going to share the results with you. So time, more than half. Language, not necessarily a large problem here. Perception of school or program, not necessarily something we believe to be a problem. And then interest, right? So, maybe parent interest. It could be, I don't know how you all interpreted that, but it could be program interest in doing the work, right? Owning some of that on ourselves. But again, how do we, if we know what the barriers are, if we understand what the barriers are, how can we then create programming, create, and I want to be clear, it's not always programming, right? It's a general attitude, it's a general kind of culture and a way that you operate in your programs, in your space. I think a lot of times we want to, and it sounds like people are doing some really great programmatic aspects of, family nights or Halloween nights for things, and those certainly help. But we'll get into just a little later. There's kind of a way that we view families and caretakers, that supports meaningful, authentic engagement. Logistics have been a bigger barrier for us, right? So, logistics, whether it's transportation, when and how, I can understand how that can be challenging for folks too. Great, so gonna get back to our slideshow. Let me just pull that up. Great, here we are. All right, so again, this is something that I think you can take back to your organizations, think about, okay, what are the ways that we sit, again, in family involvement versus family engagement? And I'm not suggesting necessarily that you overhaul everything and move, to doing one thing or the other. I think it's acknowledging, and then, if you want to create a plan or start thinking about what are the barriers, why can't we get to that piece where we're engaged versus just merely involving families, right? And what would it take? And identifying that, right? And then thinking about how do we get this information? How might we engage with families to ask, pertinent questions that can give us more data, so that we can make informed choices and have informed programmatic responses. Great. So then just looking at some outcomes, this is what happens when we have engagement, right? We see an increase in youth performance. Obviously, it jumpstarts parent engagement. So when we start moving from involvement to engagement, you see just generally more folks being willing to be engaged and not looking differently reduces discipline problems in a lot of cases. And this is a lot of research from in school, but we know that what happens out of school time, after school, also supports in school learning. The increased overall attitudes towards school, right? So when you're supporting the full family, the full kind of unit, to have positive attitudes towards school, towards activities that benefit the young person in school, the attitude about school becomes better. And it provides agency, parents, and youth opportunity for connection, communication, and collaboration. So again, is how do we, if we're in this web of support, how are we communicating across the web for the betterment and for the, um, well-being of the young person? Again, children's grades go up, attend school more regularly, more likely to enroll in higher level programs, right? So when we think about wanting young people to push themselves, to really think about their strengths, to build on the leadership that they have, when we work with families, caretakers, it is more likely that young people succeed, more likely to graduate and go into college, more excited and positive about school and learning, and have fewer, again, discipline issues inside and outside of class. And so I've got some animations here. So core values, being in relationship with family. So again, this is what we're talking about when we say, I'm not just talking about a programmatic piece. I'm not just talking about let's, have a family night, which again is huge, right? It's kind of when I start thinking about, some of our cultural responsiveness work and a lot of things that organizations will do as it relates to diversity inclusion initiatives. A low-hanging fruit is often bring your food from your culture to the office. I think that's great. I love eating. I like, trying different types of food. That is a very introductory way to thinking about how do we engage across culture with different cultures, right? So I think having those spaces, right, and making your program, your school, the community center, wherever you're working at, accessible and more welcoming to families by hosting events and things like that are really helpful. But I think that also it centers the organization and the agency, right? And so we talked about that distinction with involvement versus engagement is that is often how do we get the parents to come in and kind of fix and support what we're doing, which is important, but we also have to think about how do we go out, right? How do we, as youth workers, as people who are engaged with young people, work with them in the broader community, or at least support what is happening in the broader community so that we're seen as a partner, as a true kind of a player that supports the well-being across the board of young people. And so one of the things that we can do in the ways that I think we can start thinking about this is also thinking about values, right? So what values do families have? And what values should we be mindful of as we're thinking about being in relationship with families and caretakers? Um, we know that all young people have dreams for their families. All parents have capacity to support young people. That's where that full capacity comes from. There should be an equal kind of standing, and that responsibility rests primarily with us. So the four core values, I had, a pictorial representation of them. But again, all parents have dreams for their children and want the best for them. And I always say that I believe fundamentally, no matter what, all parents want what is best for their kids. 99.9% of time, right? I'm sure there are, horror stories that we can all tell or we have heard of, but I believe for the most part, most of the time, parents want what is best for their kids. Doesn't mean that they necessarily know how or where or the path there, right? If you think about my life, I want what's best for me. I don't necessarily know how to get there either, but I have the intention and I want, I have dreams, right? And so knowing that all parents have dreams for their children and want the best for them, and keeping that in the back of your head as you're thinking about how you engage with parents and families, I think is one of the most important pieces, because I think sometimes we can develop an antagonistic optimistic relationship with families and caretakers. Sometimes we see things that we might judge, right? We don't understand certain behaviors or the motivations behind maybe particular behaviors. We work with young people who possibly experienced a lot of trauma or have lots of challenges. And so not knowing what's going on in the home, or knowing what's going on in the home, or believing we know what's going on in the home, I think, a lot of times we then have some unfair perception of families and parents and caretakers. So holding that piece of like all parents have dreams and want the best for their kids, right? Because then it's like you want the best for their kids as well, right? You may not have dreams and goals for that young person, but you have hopes, and you really do want the best for them. That's why we're doing this work, because we care about young people. So if we can center the young people and center their well-being in this, as we think about the relationship, that goes a long way. Also, all parents have the capacity to support children's learning, right? So all parents, all families, all caretakers have the ability to support what their young person is doing in programming, in school, wherever that is. And so, again, remembering that is that parents have the ability to do this. It may not look the way that you think it should look, right? So, especially if we think about time as a big challenge, or access, even thinking about where we are now in our world of how do we run these Zoom meetings, and our expectation is that parents should be able to, connect with us virtually and do all these things. Um, they may not have capacity to do exactly what you want them to do, but there are ways that parents are currently supporting their children's learning and supporting their growth and their development and what you're doing in programming. And it's our job to figure out what that looks like. Parents and agency staff should be equal partners, right? So when you view parents as a partner, as someone who is equal, and really, honestly, this is the person who's the expert on their child. I always say that when I think about like mentoring programs and other youth development programs. This person knows their kid, right? For the most part, they may not know every detail. They may not know some parts of what their child is up to, right? Because I think we show up differently in different spaces, right? So how that young person is at home, they might be different than they are in your program sometimes. But for the most part, they spend a lot of time with their children, right? And they also have, been with them since, in many cases, since they were born, right? They've been there, they know their child, they have dreams for their child. And so thinking about it as, okay, this parent, this caretaker, this family member is the expert in their child, and I want to understand and support this child. So I'm going to lean on the expert, right? So we're here both trying to support young people, and there's equal standing, right? There are things that they contribute to the relationship, and there are things that you contribute to the relationship. And so again, viewing families, parents, caretakers as equals goes a long way in having a positive relationship. And then the responsibility for building and sustaining partnerships between agency, home, and community rests primarily with staff, especially leaders. So this is one thing of, we as program folks, is our responsibility to form that relationship, right? Caretakers, parents, families, um, you know, they want the best for their child. We know that they have capacity to do this. The way that we encourage engagement and the way that we kind of support that, it's our responsibility to do it in a way that listens to what the families need and crafts, ways that are suitable to your family, your community, and the situation that you're in. And so I think especially when you think about leadership and policies and procedures and the ways that we kind of engage with families, it starts from the top. So it starts with how have we set up this program? What is our logic model? What are the assumptions we've made about community or family? What are some of the policies around, even things like timing of when parents should pick kids up, or communication home. So I think really looking at every kind of aspect and piece of your agency and organization and thinking about where's the parent engagement there? Are we at involvement or are we at engagement? Have we thought about families in this step? Have we thought about families here? When we're picking curricula, when we're picking out books to read, have we thought about the families and ways that this book can support what's happening in the home? Have we made sure that the books and the materials and the learning tools that we have represent all families, right? So there's lots of different ways that I think we can do this. And for us is how do we find in our sphere of influence in the work that we do, how are we keeping family engagement kind of in the back of our mind and really in the forefront in a lot of different ways, but it's something that, we are always thinking about. And again, if folks have any questions or anything, please let me know. And so I want to ask folks again, thinking about engagement, want to engage you. Which of the core values are fully present and evident in your practice? So if you think about the work that you do, which ones can you see? And how can you see that? So if I walked into your organization, if I walked into your program when it's happening, whether it's on a family parent night or whether if I'm watching an interaction between you and a family member or caretaker, would I be able to see any of these core values? And also, if maybe can't answer that question, which core value may always or at times push you out of your comfort zone? Right? I think there are some things that we discussed that can be a little uncomfortable or can challenge some of the ways that we have initially thought about families or caretakers, or based on our experiences, depending on the ways that we've previously engaged, or some of the things that we've seen, some of the things we might have experienced ourselves, right? Because I think we have to own that, we all have some kind of experience of family probably in our lives. And so maybe there are some things that challenge us or push us out of our comfort zone. So folks could take a minute to just think, if you want to share anything, which of these are fully present and evident, and how do we know? How do you know? Or which one of these might be challenging for you? So I'll go over the core values again. So all parents have dreams for their children and want the best for them. All parents have capacity to support children's learning or participation in programming. Parents and agency staff should be equal partners, and the responsibility for building and sustaining partnerships rests primarily with staff, especially leaders. So those 4 values, which ones are evident in your practice, and which value maybe pushes you out of your comfort zone, right? It's hard for you to do, has been challenging for your organization. So I'll give folks about a minute or so to reflect, and I would love, again, if you want to use the question or the chat function to let me know what you're thinking, that would be great. All right, I see some responses. So one response, I think it's clear that those in our organization want the best for our youth, but we always see the equity we would like in equal partners between family and program leaders. Right, I think that can be challenging for lots of different reasons, right? We're going to briefly talk about culturally affirming activities and cultural responsiveness. At MNP, we have a few kind of core trainings, and one of those is culturally responsive practice. And I think equity and power is a big topic that we often shy away from when we're thinking about doing this work, who we are, how we show up. Um, Same thing for families, who they are, how they show up, what systems that we sit in and represent, and where they sit in those systems and what those systems represent to them. Everything from education to language, obviously race, gender, all kinds of stuff. So I think really I think sometimes we have to, not sometimes, we should just name it, right? Like, there's power balance in a lot of cases. And without acknowledging that and then saying, okay, where does that come from? How do we acknowledge it? Do we have to do some work internally in our organization? And I think every organization needs to do this work to understand that, and then to think about how we change our behaviors and change that lens we have is really important. So thank you for that. Core value that we embrace from Lucy: all parents have dreams and want what is best for their children. Right, I think that's great. Again, just remembering that it's like a small pivot sometimes and just a reminder, but I think it's huge of like, you are doing the best you can to make sure that the dreams that you have for your kids are coming true. And I am here in partnership with you to support your young person to achieve their dreams and their goals. And so, how do we work together to do that? From Mobile parents and staff, parents and program staff as equal partners feels like a challenge for a variety of reasons, including the question of who has guardianship for youth we serve and who to involve at what level. And so Mobile, they serve in an organization, or serve, excuse me, work an organization that works with youth impacted by the foster care system. And so I can understand why that is challenging, because you have a lot of different variables that, you know, other programs may not have to contend to, or perhaps do have to contend to, because the reality is that young people who are impacted by the foster care system are in lots of our other programs as well. And so how do we navigate that system, right? To be able to best support young people for whom family or caretaker, that term, what does that even mean for some of our youth, right? And then a core value that's challenging from Lucy: all parents have capacity to support their children in programming, right? You know, I think that can be hard for us to remind ourselves of or believe. And I think that for, you know, when I think about that, is what do I mean by support? What have we set up as an expectation for the way parents support and the way parents show up? If I think about my own life and my mother and the way that she engaged, we had the luxury and the privilege in some ways, in that she could work part time and be able to join the PTA and be at school and do pickups and in some ways, you know, I always joke, my mom was very adamant and very cautious about the way that educators engaged me as a young Black child, right? Being one of few in a class of mostly white children. And was suspicious, right? Rightly so, for her experience, right, as a Black woman who kind of came of age in the civil rights movement. And so her engagement looked very differently, I would say, than what my school and programming partners probably wanted and expected. And so she certainly challenged, you know, program staff and school staff um, to acknowledge the way that she was going to engage on her terms and what she believed was best for me. And you know, if I think back to it, there are some things and some ways that she definitely pushed the system and had requests that my school was not used to and had to kind of figure out. And so I think when we again think about support and what that looks like, we might have a frame in our head, and you know, our caregivers and our parents, families might challenge that frame. And so again, it's always worth then, how did we come up with that? How do we define that? Do we do that in partnership, or did we sit around and decide what support looks like? So thank you so much for sharing. That was really great. And so to move on, just really quickly to round out connecting with families. Here are three kind of ways that we can think about connecting, and some questions that I have that we don't necessarily have to answer, but things I want you to keep in mind, right, as we wrap up. So strength based, we talked about that before. What do we know about families that represents their strengths? Right? So what do we know? What do we understand and know to be true? Um, how do we know that? Right? So what assumptions could get in the way of those, you know, things that we believe to be true. And then what kind of questions or comments reaffirm strengths? So what's the language that we're using? What are the ways that we have conversations based on some of those assumptions that we have? And how do we remind ourselves to always, always, always look at not only the young people, but our families in a strength-based way? Great. So again, thinking about those questions, and these are questions that you can take back to your staff and say, "Hey, what do we know about families that represent their strengths?" If we were doing this in person with an activity or had more time, I would have you, and it's something you can do again with your staff or folks or just yourself. Jot down, what do I know to be true about families in terms of their strengths? Because I think a lot of times it's very easy to kind of identify the challenges and the things that are hard, and our families are low income families and they are engaged in this system and have this challenge or transportation or education or whatever it might be. But what is good and strong and beautiful in the assets that they have? And so I challenge you to just like make a list of all the ways that families are resilient and strong, because as you think about your programming, you can think about, how do I build on that, right? How do I take those things that these families are walking in the door with and build on those? Great. Culturally affirming. So again, just talked about cultural responsiveness, but really, how do families experience and express their culture? What does that look like for you, right? Understanding and knowing, who are you working with? Where do they come from? What is the history? How did certain cultures and folks get to where you are? How did you get there, right? That's the question I always want to say. How did I end up doing work with girls in Dorchester, the Common Square neighborhood of Dorchester, right? We have a history that we show up with, right? And we often forget that, and want to focus just on the families. But I think it's important to understand, how do they experience and express their culture? What does that look like? Because the relationship to school, to programming, to youth workers, to authority, there might be pieces of that that are, embedded, not necessarily embedded in culture, but understandings that are influenced by culture or background that we may not understand because we don't come from that culture or background, right? So I think it's important to understand that and to think about that. How will you handle language access issues, right? So we didn't note that as a challenge necessarily as much with our little poll, but I know for a fact that that is a challenge with programs. How do we have staff that represent the culture and backgrounds and speak the languages that our families represent? And if we don't, what do we do about that? Because that's a barrier that we have to figure out how we're going to then effectively communicate. There's some equity pieces around that. How do we do that without necessarily always making the child the translator? If you do have members on staff who do speak the language, I always try to remind people of this. If you have not paid them for their translation services and value those services, what does that look like in your organization? Oftentimes we'll translate things into languages, forms, documents, things like that. And then, when it comes time to actually communicate with families that might speak that language, we actually don't have a person on staff to do that. So how are we setting people up for success or failure in that way? And then what types of comments or questions are culturally affirming? What is our language? What are we doing and saying? And again, everything from books and um, you know, the ways that we show up and have different cultures show up. And it looks like I just got an error message that my sound was doing crazy things. So I apologize for that. um, but again, how do we think about this and how are we prepared for, language access issues, and how are we constantly thinking about how we affirm um, family and caregivers culture, young people's culture in programming. A food day, I meant no shade to a nice little food potluck or whatever. It's a start, right? It's a way that we can engage with people, right? Bringing in food is, I think, breaking bread and sharing food is really important. And then how do we continue from there? And then last but not least, respectful of families, right? So this is a continuation of culture, but how much do we know about cultural differences related to being respectful? I think their respect is a loaded term. I think what we believe to be respectful might be different than what someone else believes to be respectful. Again, thinking about relationship to authority, thinking about relationship to school and programming. So what do we know about that? One of my colleagues that I used to work with, Danielle, always told stories of she, and we would in our trainings, we were both Black women. I am African American. I think she grew up here, but her parents are Jamaican. And so she spoke a lot about the relationship that they had to school and programming, and that, we trust our teachers. She was like, my parents trusted. They sent me to school. I did a job. The teacher was the authority in the classroom. The teacher knew what was going on, and we were to listen to the teacher. And so engagement looked really different because it was a matter of I trust the system, right? Right. So my parents who grew up in Jamaica, who came here, had to learn how to engage differently. Whereas again, you think about my mother and my father and the way that they engaged with the school system, there was not trust there. And so, what respect and engagement looked like, and then the assumptions we make, because Danielle's parents are not engaging or showing up or doing what we would expect them to do. On the flip side, my mom is up there every day, right? So again, what assumptions do we have and know about when we think about how people engage respectfully? And if you could see me, I'm using air quotes here. And then how should we demonstrate respect to the families in those overt and subtle ways, right? So do we understand culturally what that looks like? Do we have a sense of the ways that our families, and it can be challenging because you could be in a community where there are lots of different cultures and lots of different ways that that happens and that looks like, and you have to balance that and figure out, how do I inform my programming based on the expectations of the community, of the culture, of the caretakers, of the young people. So these are just questions to kind of ponder, and some of the questions, right, especially around cultural responsiveness and respect, they call for some learning on our part, right? And so that again is where we think about um, the responsibility of the program staff to do this work. And so it's not, again, just we're going to throw, a parent night, we're going to have events. I think a lot of times when we think about, family and caregiver engagement, we think about events, but there's a general attitude and a culture shift that we have to engage in that starts with us, and it takes some deep work. And I think it's worth, investigating and interrogating internally in your organization, asking these questions and seeing, what people say. Even just, what do we believe about families? Because that's an interesting question, and I think you'll get lots of different responses based on, what people believe. So with that, we are going to wrap up. I do see that there are questions, so I'll answer those. And if other people have questions or thoughts, feel free to type those in the question box. When I say take action, again, action can start with just a conversation internally, right? It's really looking at, where are you at? What are you currently doing? How do you need to kind of interrogate and think differently about that? And or, what conversations do you need to have with your coworkers, with caregivers and families, right? So that you can get more information, more data to make more informed choices, and take action in a way that leads to true, authentic engagement. So I did see, I think, one question. Let me open my little question poll up. Oh, how can we reach you, and would you do offer any trainings on site or at our center, for instance? Yes, that's great segue. So MMP offers trainings. We'll go anywhere in the state, all the way to Berkshires to the Cape. I would say if you're inviting me out to the Cape, can we make it May through, September, so we can spend some time down there. But really, we will come anywhere. And when I say come at this point, given kind of what's going on in the world, we can do a webinar for your staff, or we have other kind of platforms that we can use. So we will certainly come out and provide, that's what we would call technical assistance or consultation. And we can work with you to customize it more for your organization. So a lot of times we'll have, vignettes or stories or different ways that have more scenario-based activities so people can practice. We're certainly willing to do that work. So when I email you, I'll email out this presentation, and there's actually a great toolkit that we have from a resource, I believe, out in California that I'll share with you as well. So you'll have my contact information. I'll put Milani on there because she's our ASOST contact if folks are interested in that. I do know in the past we've had some work where I don't know what your grants cover or what that looks like, but we definitely have been brought out for other ASOS grantees who've done like regional gatherings and been able to use some, additional funding. I think that ASOS provided to do regional stuff to bring us out. So in Webster, we've done that a few times, and a few other places. So thank you for that question. If there aren't any other questions or anything else, and the upcoming trainings, right now that is blank because MMP is kind of looking, reassessing, wanting to make sure that the trainings that we have and the webinars that we're offering are relevant to you, especially, again, given what is going on in the world. The ASOS ones that are coming up, I'll make sure you get that. We have supporting immigrant and refugee youth, and then we have one on closure that's supposed to be in May. We will probably do something on closure much sooner because I think, again, schools closing, programming going remote, and while we're trying our best to maintain relationships, there's a shift in the relationship in a way that we should acknowledge that this relationship may end differently than we want it to, and that we should start brainstorming and being mindful of that and thinking about what's the impact on young people due to, us dealing with this pandemic. So my email is not listed here, but it's jsmith@massmentors.org. You can find Milani and Beth right there, and keep in touch with us. Stay tuned to our website and our social media for other resources. So thank you all so much. I will let you go. I am 1 minute behind 12:30, so apologies for that. Thank you for your patience as we were working out those technical difficulties. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. We are accessible. Have a great day and good luck with everything that's going on. I hope you and your families and your young people and your communities are staying safe and healthy and in relationship and together at this time. Thanks so much.